Brothers and sisters, we'd like to begin the program with the recitation of the Holy Qur'an by Amara Saria. Please welcome with Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Surah Yusuf, verse 58 to 62. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وجاء إخوة يوسف فدخلوا عليه فعرفهم وهم له منكرون. ولما جهزهم بجهازهم قال ائتوني بأخ لكم من أبيكم ألا ترون أني أوفي الكيل وأنا خير المنزلين. فإن لم تأتوني به فلا كيل لكم عندي ولا تقربون. قالوا سنراود عنه أباه وإنا لفاعلون. وقال لفتيانه اجعلوا بضاعتهم في رحالهم لعلهم يعرفونها إذا انقلبوا إلى أهلهم لعلهم يرجعون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much. Today we're fortunate to welcome Miqdaad Versi, who will be speaking to us on the topic of Islamophobia in Britain, what to know during Islamophobia month. Please welcome him with Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. I'm sure you all know Miqdaad Versi very well. He is part of the public affairs team at the Muslim Council of Britain, leading on issues including tackling Islamophobia in the public sphere. As a founder of the Centre for Media Monitoring, he is a campaigner for responsible reporting in the media and has been called the man correcting stories about Muslims by the BBC after eliciting dozens of apologies and corrections from national media outlets. His commentary on Muslims in the UK has been published in tens of articles in The Guardian, The Independent, The Prospect and The New Statesman, and with interviews across most media outlets. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Thank you very much for having me today. Today I'm going to be speaking about Islamophobia in the UK, and in particular, I'm going to focus quite very much on the UK itself, rather than other areas. We're very obviously very conscious of the fact that Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, not a phenomenon restricted to the UK. We've got what's happening in China right now with the Uyghur Muslims. We've got what's happening in India now with Modi. We've got what's happening in Israel, Sri Lanka, Poland, Austria, Belgium, France. All of these areas have quite extensive and problematic engagement with Muslim communities in the way that they frame Muslims and talk about Muslims and are racist towards Muslims. So that is there, but I'm not going to be focusing on that. That doesn't mean that those aren't important or even more important than what I'm talking about. But today, as it's part of Islamophobia Awareness Month, I thought I'd use this opportunity to talk about Islamophobia here in this country. So, sorry. Let me go back. How do I go back? There we go. Thank you. No, there's one. There we go. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. So, yeah, that's fine. So when it comes to Islamophobia, I think that the most important thing is just understanding what Islamophobia is. Okay. Now, let's not put any names on anything. Let's just try and think about what do you see as Islamophobia. You know, if I were to ask people actually in the audience, if I were to ask people right now, what do you see as Islamophobia? Can you give me an example of what you see as Islamophobia? Mansur Anti? No. Sorry? What type of racism? Give me an example. Someone calling you, okay? What else? Discrimination in what? Give me an example. Any example? At work. Discrimination at work. Okay, what else? Well, give an example of Islamophobia. Ahmed. Name calling. Okay, yeah. Name calling. Anything else? So there's lots of things, right? So you've got these negative attitudes or stereotypes. When people say Muslims are X, Y, or Z, and we'll come to lots of examples of this in a second. That's one example, right? You've got structural discrimination issues in the middle. Okay, you've got, for example, job discrimination and health, and we'll talk about all these other areas in a second. And you've also got verbal and physical aggression. Let's not forget the hate crime element as well. But you'll see that these are all different phenomenons. They're not the same thing. Hatred is on the right-hand side when you've got actual, physical verbal assault on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, you've got opinions which can go all the way up to hatred. And then you've got something in the middle, which is called structural discrimination, which could be very different. It doesn't necessarily have to be because you hate a Muslim. It just may be for many other reasons why that might be the case. And all of these are very different. But think about this in terms of any other phenomenon which looks very similar. And if you look at, for example, anti-black racism, it's very similar. You have negative attitudes and stereotypes. You have structural discrimination if you look at the criminal justice system. You have verbal or physical aggression against black people because of their blackness. So what do you know? So what is common and what is very clear is Islamophobia is a type of racism. Okay, it's a type of racism, but it's not a type of racism that's targeting black people, for example, or Asian people. Islamophobia is a type of racism that targets expressions of your Muslim identity in some way. Okay, of Muslimness, which is what we call Muslimness, or perceived Muslimness. Do you know the first person to have been killed after 9/11 in America in retaliation? You know who that was? It was a Sikh man, because a right-wing racist thought that person was Muslim. And that's Islamophobia. The person thought he was a Muslim and he attacked him and killed him. So Islamophobia is a type of racism, but it's a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslim identity or perceived Muslim identity. So we should be very clear on what that is. And this definition that I've just mentioned right now is a definition that has been adopted and endorsed by the top academics across the field of social sciences. From people like Tariq Moudud, Abdul Karim Vakil, all the way down across these different people who are on this screen. These are people who've been in the field for decades, okay? And that's what they talk about. For them, when I was talking to some of these academics about this definition, the most important thing for them was the recognition and understanding that Islamophobia isn't just hatred. It's not anti-Muslim hatred. It's not just bigotry. It's not just discrimination. It's racism, which encompasses all of these things together. Because that's a phenomenon we understand. And Islamophobia is very similar to that, except it is something that's targeting expressions of Muslim identity or Muslimness. And what you see is that this definition has actually got endorsements from all the main parties, with one obvious exception, which is which party? Conservative Party, yep, that's right. And dozens of councils across the UK, and most Muslim groups have adopted this definition, but not everyone. So what the key thing that some people have a challenge with when it comes to this term is they have an issue with the idea that racism, Islamophobia isn't a type of racism. But everyone who is in the field thinks it is a type of racism. And most of the Muslim groups who recognize it see it as a type of racism. And if you look at how Islamophobia manifests, it manifests in the exact same way as racism manifests. And therefore you have to think about why someone might think otherwise. So one of the arguments that is used to say that this Islamophobia is not a type of racism is they say, well, for example, if you're in a university and you're looking for a prayer room and a university doesn't provide a prayer room when they have the ability to do so, and they don't make it accessible, basically university accessible to Muslims who want to pray, they say that's not a type of racism, but it is. Of course, it's a type of racism. They're discriminating against someone from being who they are in the public space. So I think that actually doesn't really have much merit. So what I want to go through right now when we talk about Islamophobia is talk about these three areas. These social attitudes about Muslims first, and then we'll go through discrimination, and then we'll go through hate crime. So let's start with social attitudes. The scale of Islamophobia in this country should not be underestimated. 56% believe Islam, not fundamentalist groups, pose a threat to Western liberal democracy. A third believe that they are no-go zones. They believe the conspiracy theory that there are these no-go zones where non-Muslims can't even enter. And it's not just adults who think this. Almost a third of young children believe the conspiracy theory that Muslims are taking over England. Muslims are taking over England. They're 4 or 5% of the country are Muslim. The idea that we're taking over England is outrageous. Why? There's this idea that Muslims have this power. It's this conspiracy theory that the Muslims are taking away the rights of the indigenous white population here. That's what's driving a lot of this thinking. And 18% believe that Muslim immigration in this country is part of a bigger plan to make Muslims a majority of the country's population. So what they actually think is that Muslims come together and they make a plan to try and get and become the majority in this country, when there is obviously no such thing. So
Can I ask a question, or are there questions at the end?
ask, please.
So, is it your view that the majority of people have racist views?
No, I don't think a majority have racist views. I mean,
56% is obviously a majority. And
that is 56%, and this is not this was.
that's a racist view, presumably.
Oh, but that is a view that is. This is where, whether you think Islam is a threat as a fully racist view, potentially not. I think that as you get to the numbers which are smaller and smaller, it becomes more and more racist, right? In the way I've done it. I've explicitly tried to start with a number which is quite broad to talk about a broader topic, that Islam is a threat, which in and of itself is a problem, but perhaps doesn't necessarily flow directly into a racist view, but it probably does when you start looking at believing conspiracy theories about Muslims. That's where it becomes more. I think it would be unusual. I think much polling is out there on this, and there are many different. I could spend the whole time just talking about polling, and the scale is, you see between 20 and 30 and 40% of people have really quite negative views about Muslims in different ways. Some of which form into actual racism, and some of which are hostile but maybe not fully racist. And I think that's where it is. So what are the stereotypes that people talk about Muslims? Now remember, when you talk about racism, you can never directly define it. There's always a bit of a gray area, right? And that doesn't mean the definition is wrong or any problematic. It's just the reality of racism. So if you look at certain issues about anti-black racism, you'll see certain people who think certain things are racist and some people who think it's not. It's possible to have different views on whether something is actually a type of racism or not. And similarly with Islamophobia, certain things, it's quite hard to say, is it definitely Islamophobia or not? What you can say, however, there are certain examples which in most situations would be considered to be Islamophobia. So if you, for example, cause or call for or aid or justify harm against Muslims, you call for aid, aggression against Muslim targets, denying the right of a Muslim to be an equal citizen, dehumanizing, demonizing, or making stereotypical allegations about Muslims, etc., etc. So it's very clear that there are certain stereotypes that almost always will be considered to be Islamophobic. And what is also well established, and what we have to also be conscious of, is there certain things which are clearly not Islamophobic. If you are critical of the faith of Islam, that's not necessarily Islamophobic at all. Even if you think Prophet Muhammad is not a real prophet, that's not Islamophobic, because many other religions obviously don't believe that. You can have theological discussions, obviously, and you can have very, very strong views against the faith of Islam, against Prophet or other things. But the key point that matters here is sometimes people pretend they're using the idea of being anti-Islam, and actually what they're doing is they're being anti-Muslim in what they're talking about. And we'll come to some examples. In all of these, though, context matters. But let's look at some of these examples that we've talked about. We talked about conspiracy theories about Muslims. So we've got this idea, for example, this tweet about Sharia no-go zones, or Muslims taking over the country, or Muslims wanting to ban Christian festivals like Christmas and Easter. These are all conspiracy theories that often are talked about when it comes to Muslims. Then you've got social attitudes about Muslims, so dehumanizing Muslims. Examples are, you're a terrorist. I mean, even when I was in school, we used to get called names, things like that when we were younger. And perhaps something I wouldn't tolerate if I was older. Muslims are predisposed to terrorism. Muslims hate women. Muslims are wife beaters. Muslims support terrorism. Muslim appeal. These are all clearly Islamophobic, almost in whatever the context is. You'll see on the right, bottom right, Nadine Dorris, who's actually a minister in the government right now, and she said any clothing a woman is forced to wear which hides both her beauty and her bruises should be banned and have no place in our liberal progressive country. Why did she talk about bruises? Quite clearly, she's making certain comments about Muslims in a very, very clear way. What we have to also think about is sometimes dehumanizing or demonizing or making stereotypical allegations about Muslims can be done in a very clever way. It can be done in a way where the fact may be true, but the representation is hugely misleading. So, for example, Muslims silent on terror. There is a poll which they are citing, which talk about how Muslims were not reporting people to prevent. But that is very different from Muslims being silent on terror. Because actually the vast, vast majority, 94% of Muslims would report someone who has terrorism, which is very similar to the population as a whole. And similarly, this 1 in 5 Brit Muslims have sympathy with jihadis, massively misrepresenting the poll data, which again is problematic. And when you talk about misrepresentation, it's really important to think here how this works. Let's say, for example, before I get to that next one, let's say, for example, an immigrant happens to commit a serious crime in Germany, for example. That immigrant happens to be Muslim. If on a major news story it talks about Muslim conducts this or engages in this criminal activity, it's a problem. It's not factually wrong. It's not factually wrong at all. That Muslim did do it. But they never normally talk about those issues. There are hundreds and thousands of cases of people doing criminal activity across the country and across Europe. But they've chosen that one in particular. And they've used the Muslimness of that individual, even though it's nothing to do with their Muslimness, to drive that story and to get their clicks and support they want to do. So that's why some of these dehumanizing and demonizing and stereotypical allegations need to be thought of very carefully. Another example of the stereotypical allegations is Muslims are liars and use taqiyya. Now, other than the fact that many of these people don't even know what taqiyya is, it actually is used. I haven't used this example here, but Melanie Phillips talks about this. Is a columnist in the Times, someone who is not only in the Times but also on BBC Radio 4 in Moral Maze. So this is not someone who's on Question Time relatively regularly or a few times at least. This is someone who's a public figure, and she uses these types of Islamophobic tropes about Muslims. The idea that Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic, and this is something that the Jewish Chronicle is very bad at, as one of the leading newspapers in the Jewish community. Unfortunately, the Jewish Chronicle has had to apologize on a number of occasions for lies about Muslims. And this is just one example by Nada al-Sandri, which I've talked of here. But and Melanie Phillips in the bottom right corner, again in the Jewish Chronicle, talking about how Islamophobia is not the same as anti-Semitism, in the sense that anti-Semitism is real and Islamophobia is not. These types of stereotypical allegations about Muslims by real hateful individuals is another clear example of Islamophobia. Rod Liddell is someone else who talks about it. He was suspended from Labour for describing anti-Semitism as visceral for many Muslims. And again, this is the idea that they're trying to do here is create this idea that Muslims are away from everyone else. Muslims are vote triggers. That's another one of the stereotypical allegations. What about Muslims makes them more vote riggers? Well, Nadine Dorris, again, this is someone who's in the news quite recently and who I mentioned earlier. She's a minister in the government right now, in the Conservative Party, in the UK government. She talked about how vote rigging and organisation in Muslim communities is commonplace. There is no evidence to suggest that's the case. And what's it got to do with Muslim communities? But this is a minister in the government speaking like this before she was a minister. Social attitudes, another example of social attitudes is when they call Muslims invaders or a fifth column trying to take over or create what they call Londonistan or Eurabia. This is almost always when you see the word Londonistan, you'll know that this person is trying to make fun of the fact that London's being taken over by Muslims and is becoming a Muslim country like Pakistan or something else. They don't realize that Istan isn't really anything to do with Muslims per se at all. I mean, the fact that the most most Muslims in the country, in the globe, you've got Indonesia, you've got India, you've got Pakistan. Many of these other countries have no istan on them, and still they talk about it like that. Nigel Farage talked about British Muslims being a fifth column, fuels fear of immigration, and there are many other examples. This example in the middle here is a Conservative parliamentary candidate talking about Muslim invaders. Another example is the idea that you expect Muslims to condemn terrorism, and this is really, really important. There is this idea that if you're a Muslim, you need to be out there condemning terrorism and asking every single person around you, are you a terrorist, and stop them from being a terrorist. It's an astonishing situation when you see how people act. And again, I've used the same individual again, Dean Doris. She expects Muslims to condemn grooming gangs when there's nothing to do with them. So Sadiq Khan in London, okay. Grooming gangs are not something that are known to be a problem in London. It's not something that Sadiq Khan has any involvement with, any reason to talk about. But what happens when Sadiq Khan talks about hate speech? Nadine Dorris, as minister in this government, talks about acting on sex abusing grooming gangs instead. What's it got to do with him? He's in London. He has no ability to make any change when it comes to grooming gangs across the country. And why did she choose to talk to him about it? Because of his Muslimness, and that's a problem. Another point is questioning the loyalty of Muslims. The idea that Muslims won't be loyal to this country and won't be part of this country. Here is an MP for South Cambridgeshire, formerly an advisor to Boris Johnson, who said that basically because Muslims weren't supporting the war in Iraq, that means they had divided loyalties. Why can't you have a different opinion unless you are disloyal to this country? A specific title which, again, he focused when it comes to a large minority. He was talking about minorities here, not talking about those who just happen to be anti-war. So look, there are hundreds of these examples, and I could continue going, but there's I don't think that's valuable to do. So let's talk about structural discrimination, the second main area that I think is worth discussing. Half of Muslim households are considered to be in poverty, compared with less than 20% in the overall population. That's a huge number. How does that happen? How does this type of structural issue happen in the society where the disparity between Muslims and the broader population is so stark? Let's look at The Sun, and The Sun did this study, which they found out that if your name was Muhammad, it cost you £1,000 more to insure your car. This was a study done by The Sun newspaper. British Muslim women are 71% more likely to be unemployed due to workplace discrimination, according to I think this was an independent, based on a study, I think, from Bristol University. If your name is it easier to get a job if your name was Adam or Muhammad? They did a study, and they found that actually Muhammad, you're less likely to be able to get a job. So because of that, they're thinking whether we need to have blind CV going through. When people get jobs, they shouldn't actually see the names of people, and that should help resolve some of those issues. But then you look at structural discrimination in other ways. It's not just in terms of poverty. It's not just in terms of employment. It's also in terms of sport. Football authorities were accused of not taking Islamophobia seriously because of a grassroots a study that came out. One study that was out there. And you think about what are the key structures in place that have led to some of these things happening? How does Islamophobia manifest itself? What's driving it? And what you see is that, according to this University of Cambridge study, it was the mainstream media, the way that they report about Muslim communities, which contributed to this atmosphere of rising hostility towards Muslim communities. Or this University of Leicester report, which said that politicians and media are what are fueling hate crime. And if you see all of these examples I've talked about in terms of the narratives about Muslims, all of them, or many of them, find their sources within elements of our mainstream media. And if you look at our media in this country, journalists, according to Ipsos Mori Veracity Index 2017, but there are later versions as well of this, which show that only 26% of people would trust journalists to tell the truth. And what does it say about our democracy, who are supposed to inform us that that's what they think about Muslims? So here are some statistics about the media which might be useful for you to know. If you look at the Center for Media Monitoring, looked at 11,000 articles in a quarter of a year, so in 3 months of a year, and it found that terrorism was the most recurring theme when it comes to Muslims and Islam. 59% of all articles analyzed associated Muslims with negative behavior, and over a third misrepresented or generalized about Muslims, with 37% of articles in right-leaning and religious publications being very biased, i.e. really problematic when it comes to Muslims. Examples are here. So we talked a little bit about Muslim silence on terror, which plays to that stereotype. But look at this bottom one here, if you can see. Here's what terrorists look like. Okay? So this is an example of something which is so problematic. Obviously, these three individuals are terrorists in different ways. Jihadi John, as they call, and that the fact they even use Jihadi John is problematic. But Jihadi John, he was a terrorist. Of course he was. Osama bin Laden, of course he was. The White Widow, of course they were. These are people who have done really, really, really atrocious things. But here's what they look like. Why did the Sun decide to do this? Why do they have this cut out and keep guide that they put to talk about here's what terrorists look like? Because this is what this is a woman who's wearing a headscarf. This is a man who's wearing a turban. That's the type of thing that they wanted to get across. It's hugely, hugely problematic. Look at these other case studies about Muslims which build this narrative. More than 50 million Muslims are willing to support those who carry out terror attacks to defend their religion. Just imagine, where do you think this more than 50 million Muslims are willing to support those who carry out terror attacks? Where do you think that came from? It was basically a right-wing bigot, a right-wing individual who decided to do a poll and make a massive extrapolation, multiply it in a way that is clearly statistically ridiculous. It is outrageous that something like this could be in a national newspaper. A nativity scene is banned in case it offends one of 4 Muslims living in a town. That was found out to be a lie by Snopes, a fact-checking website. The bottom right one I find the most interesting, and another indicator of what's happening in the media right now. The Express, which says, new £5 notes could be banned by religious groups as bank can't promise they're halal. So what's that got to a banknote being halal? I mean, based on what? What actually happened here, and this is really important to note, is that the Hindu communities were concerned because there was beef extract or some form of beef element within these notes. Not a single Muslim organization complained about it. So it had nothing to do with halal. It was to do with the Hindu groups having some concerns about beef extracts on it. And that was the reason for the Express to do this. And they said, and this was the headline they put. What's even more worth noting is the press regulator didn't think this was problematic. Didn't think this was inaccurate. They thought this was fine. It's a real indicator of the challenge when it comes to the media. Here are a few more examples. I think the bottom left one is worth noting. Da'wah is the Islamist mind poison that turns lost souls into lone wolves. Da'wah is an Islamist mind poison? I mean, what is that? Niall Ferguson is someone who's written about Muslims problematically in other contexts as well. Muslim terror attacks get significantly more press coverage than those by other groups. The bottom right one, once in Syria, she dressed her toddler son in ISIS-branded clothing and taught the youngster to say Allahu Akbar. So teaching your youngster to say Allahu Akbar is a problem according to the Mirror here. The top right one I think is one of my favorite examples. What happened was that it says supermarket terror. Gunman screaming Allahu Akbar opens fire in a Spanish supermarket. What actually happened was a Basque separatist shouted in Basque, not in Arabic, nothing to do with Muslims, nothing to do with anything, and actually didn't even have a gun. He did have a gun, but was nothing to do with Muslims at all. And yet they ran this story saying supermarket terror, gunman screaming Allahu Akbar. When we complained and it was changed, they changed it from terror to horror. Why? Because it's no longer Muslim. Okay, and it's astonishingly clear how Islamophobic some of these sentiments are. Muslim savages are very clear. Let's start deporting Muslim extremists. Shut every Muslim school down. You know, you've got people like Melanie Phillips who write books which have headlines called Londonistan. It is a real problem. But this is not just restricted to the far right or the right-wing media. Let's talk about the BBC, for example. They brought in Raheem Kassam. He was on BBC Today program, one of the most important radio programs in this country. And he said there are significant numbers inside Muslim communities that support Sharia, that support FGM, that will not report terrorists in their midst. And was he challenged at all? No. It was allowed to be said without any challenge whatsoever. When the BBC Radio introduced Katie Hopkins, and we all know who Katie Hopkins are and what she says, how did they introduce her? Did they talk about anything about her Muslim, anti-Muslim views? The fact that she wants to talk about a final solution for Muslims? No. They talked to her. They introduced her as the journalist, the pundit, and the so-called truth teller, the one-time apprentice candidate. This is the way these people are introduced. Consider Frank Gaffney. So Frank Gaffney, he's an individual who is described as one of America's most notorious Islamophobes. Okay, so this logo there next to the Today program, that logo there that you can see on the front, that logo, he said it's basically Operation Defense Shield, which the Missile Defense Agency in the United States created. He said that was an Islamic crescent because Obama was a Muslim, basically. And it was Muslims. It was another idea of Muslims taking over. So he's a conspiracy theorist about Muslims. So he was brought onto the Today program on the BBC about a Muslim-related issue, and he was introduced as just an expert. They acknowledged this was an error after it was complained. But guess what happened? A year later, he was brought in again, and he said the exact. And again, they didn't introduce him properly. And as I said, it's not the right-wing media only. You know, the Times is perhaps seen as more centrist when it comes to some of these issues. But look at the way they lie about Muslims quite consistently. What I would say, and I make this without any apology, that if there is ever a story in the Times about a Muslim or about Muslims in general, do not trust it. Do not trust it. Find another source. It may be true, it might not be, but do not consider it a reliable source when it comes to anything controversial about Muslims. At all. Do not trust the Times. And I can give you lots of examples to demonstrate why that's the case. And this is just one example when they talk about Christian child forced into Muslim foster care. It's an outrageous lie as to what happened. They just lie about Muslims. This is 4 front pages in 1 week, lying about Muslims again and again and again. On the front page. And you may think, this doesn't matter, it's only the newspapers. I've told you why it matters. It creates that narrative about Muslims in the public space. But not only that, look at these bottom tweets that you might be able to see or you may not, which talks about how Tommy Robinson, the English Defence League, Paul Golding, all of these far-right, racist, Islamophobic bigots use the Times and use the story about the Times to share their narrative of hate. So what can be done? So what we're trying to do is bring the evidence together, try and engage national media to try and make it better and tackle some of these issues that we're talking about. But that's not going to solve it all, okay? But it's just one part of what we need to think about. So we've talked about different structures. We've talked about poverty. We've talked about health, education. We've talked about employment. We've talked about media. And now let's talk about politics. These are all important structural ways that Muslims are discriminated against. Well, 57% of Conservative Party members have a negative attitude towards Muslims and 21% a very negative attitude. 66% believe the Islamophobic trope and the conspiracy theory that there are no-go areas where Sharia law dominates and non-Muslims can't enter. It is outrageous to see that within the Conservative Party in particular. And there are hundreds of cases as are laid out on here. But it's not restricted to the Conservative Party alone. Within the Labour Party, over 1 in 4 Muslim members have directly experienced Islamophobia in the party. Over 1 in 3 have witnessed Islamophobia. Nearly half do not believe the party takes Islamophobia seriously. This is a serious problem across different areas, not just within the Conservative Party and also within the Labour Party. So again, I could go on and on about the structural discrimination that Muslims face. And I could go on and on about the narrative and the social attitudes about Muslims. So let's talk about verbal and physical abuse. This is quite clearly Islamophobia, and it's so really problematic. We've got terrorist attacks about Muslims. You've got people who rip off women's hijab while shouting, "You effing stupid Muslim." You've got a man who tried to kill a Muslim woman as a revenge for terror attacks. You've got someone who tried to use a power drill on someone's kneecaps and feet, screaming at an Islam convert, saying, "We don't like you Muslims over here. You know, I effing hate them." And you can look at statistics about it rather than just these narratives and examples, and you'll see that just about half of all religious hate crime are targeted at Muslims. You could see that 75% of Muslim respondents to a survey thought Islamophobia was getting worse. You can look at examples like Punish a Muslim Day, where letters were thrown around about how you can hurt Muslims in different ways. So you look at all of these things and you see the scale of Islamophobia in different ways. It's not something that should be discarded. And if you look at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, they in 2018, they found that 70% of Muslims had experienced Islamophobia or religious-based prejudice, as they called it in the HRC report, within the last 12 months. It's astonishing to see how it is. But when you try and tackle some of these issues, okay, you'll get pushback. But the reality is we have an organization now which is trying to tackle one element of it when it comes to the way the media talks about Islam Muslims. Because as we saw earlier from the studies, mainstream media is a major driver of creating the atmosphere of hostility towards Muslims. So let's try and look at what we can do about that. So there is an organization called the Center for Media Monitoring, which I founded, so full disclosure there, as part of the Muslim Council of Britain, and Muslim Council of Britain was driving this. And the core goal of that is promoting fair and responsible reporting about Islam and Muslims. And there are lots of reports that are out there, but what you see is when you start challenging, you get some of the worst journalists out there to realize that we're watching. And that's what matters. So here is James Delingpole, who said, "My main resolution in 2018 is to avoid upsetting Miqdaad Versi, the ever-village." So good. Let him be careful about what he says. Let's talk about Trevor Kavanagh, another right-wing commentator who's done appalling things about Muslims. It is impossible to write about Muslims without catching the eagle eye of Miqdaad Versi. So what is the point of what I'm trying to get here? It is that if we can demonstrate that we're watching carefully, it can make a difference. And we can build that evidence base. Look at this example, Powder Cake Paris. This was a double-page spread in the Daily Mail. And it had so many lies about Muslims. So many lies about Muslims. And there was this consistent stream of stories about Muslims for a whole period of time. And this is an example of one. It basically said that there were 300,000 illegal immigrants in a town where the actual population of that town was about 100,000. It had so many lies in this story. This, on the right-hand side, you can't read it fully, but just imagine how many words that correction is. This is like almost an essay trying to correct the story that was there. And it's worth noting, these are all the corrections. These are the corrections that the regulator was able to force them to put down. There were a whole number of other lies that this individual, Andrew Malone, put out there, but they weren't able to force the newspaper to do. For example, this individual, having had all these other lies which had to be corrected, also said things like, he went around and he wasn't able to find a single person who was willing to shake his hand because he was a kafir. In a whole city, he wasn't able to find anyone who was able to shake his hand because he was a kafir. This was not just talking about people of different, him being a man and other women. He was saying that there was not a single Muslim in the whole area who was willing to shake his hand because he was a kafir. This is the type of nonsense these people put out. But how did it get through the editorial board? Anyway, whatever. You try and work with regulators whilst recognizing the limits of these regulators. You try and engage with these managing editors, have round tables with some of the most senior people in journalism, and you try and engage with social media giants because guess what? Social media is a major way where a lot of these things happen. But we have to recognize the scale of what's happening here. Who are building these narratives about Muslims? Who are creating this atmosphere where social attitudes about Muslims, where discrimination, where violent hate against Muslims, where this racism that's targeting expressions of your Muslim identity is happening? Where is it coming from? It's politicians, it's influential commentators, it's think tanks, it's media outlets, it's institutions, and it's ordinary people. And there is a lot of work that needs to get done. And so when you start thinking about what is happening and all the different structures in place that have allowed and actually even encouraged and driven Islamophobia across all these different spaces, we realize that the scale of work is not something that can be tackled overnight. This is something that is embedded within many structures in our society and has to be tackled like all forms of racism need to be tackled, from the very top to the very bottom. And we have to recognize, if we do not challenge this and do not tackle this from now, this will only grow and be an even bigger problem as we go forward. I'd like to end there. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Miqdaad. I missed the beginning, so you may have already covered this, but you've demonstrated very clearly that there's lots of Islamophobia, but I'm not sure you've told us what's motivating it. Why do people feel the need to make these fake news about us?
So, very good question. Thank you. So there are many views and theories about this. The thing that I think is probably most likely is that there are those out there, and there's certain think tanks out there, who believe that Islam and Muslims are a genuine threat to this country. They think that they want to prevent us taking over. They believe this conspiracy that Muslims are trying to take over. The Muslims, in different ways, like there's this, the big conspiracy theory that there are Jews out there who are creating and opening borders and to allow these Muslim immigrants to come through, and these Muslim immigrants will basically work and do the work for the Jewish community. It is disgusting conspiracy. It's anti-Semitic and Islamophobic conspiracy theories about Muslims, right? The grand conspiracy theory. I think there are a significant number of people within certain influential circles who believe these conspiracy theories. So when they believe that Muslims are out there and are a big threat to us in some way, everything else then follows naturally from that. It means that any story they see which is bad about Muslims is within that narrative. Muslims are trying to take over. Muslims are a threat to us. Muslims are different to us. All of these can fall into that narrative of Muslims are the other in some way. And you see that in individual action, or you see that in broader action. You'll see this in terms of why are Muslims perceived to be anti-Semitic, why are Muslims perceived to be terrorists, all because it creates this they are other away from us and they're a threat to us. And I think that being a threat to us is the biggest narrative that drives a lot of this conspiracy theory around us.
Doesn't that sound a bit like a conspiracy theory, that there's a small cabal of deluded anti-Semites running the country and all of our opinions?
No, so I'm not. I think these views at different scales have permeated many sections of society. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory when you look at the polling and the stats about these things. It's a significant proportion of our country who have these views. I mean, the polling shows it.
I'm not saying that they're not Islam. I'm saying that this idea that they think that Jews are letting Muslims come in to take over.
The grand conspiracy theory. I'm not saying that everyone believes that theory. I'm saying that theory in different ways has permeated many different sections. If you see I think one of the stats that was there, 56% of people think that Islam is a threat to our British way of life, or something along those lines. I mean, there are different polls which show slightly lower numbers than that, but 56%, there's others which talk about 30 or 40%, depending on how you frame the question. But that is a major view, that the idea that Muslims are a threat is not a very, very minority view. It's a view that actually has, in different guises and depending on which poll you look at, much broader consensual view. So the idea of a threat, not necessarily the extreme threat of the great conspiracy theory, grand replacement theory, not just that's not the only thing, but that's an example of some the worst manifestation of the idea that Muslims are a threat. And I think that if you look at many of these examples of Islamophobia and how they've manifested, they all seem to come from a very similar thing that Muslims are the other, Muslims are a threat, Muslims are a problem, Muslims are opposed to us in many ways. It's different to many of the other. I don't know. It seems to me that is a very relatable narrative about Muslims that many other things can easily hook onto, and that's why it's gained greater traction, and that's where it's come from. So what you see is that every single thing that then happens, because it can be hooked onto that narrative, it just works very well to build up against it. So what's driving it? There are definitely these think tanks which are out there which are pushing that narrative very hard. That is a fact. How much actual traction these people get? Well, they're invited by ministers, and their events are attended by ministers. So I mean, is it a conspiracy theory to think that they have influence? I don't think so. I mean, ministers are going to their events, ministers are engaging with them. They are cited by ministers in parliament when they're talking about Islamophobia. Islamophobic groups are cited by ministers. I don't know. Maybe some people might think it's conspiracy. I think it's literally what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. I also missed the beginning. But two things. One is this sort of more or less giving up on multiculturalism, right? Or converting into what Cameron called muscular multiculturalism, which means nothing, all right? The other one is the whole, of course, right-wing narrative, which of course Policy Exchange and Institute of Economic Affairs and all those guys, and as you said, these ministers go and promote their works and so on. Promoting this, I mean, the latest case is the case of Paul Dacre, the editor of Daily Mail, whom they want to impose as the chair of the Ofcom. Sort of sly ways of doing this. Exactly what happened to Peterson, they want to do that to Dacre. But so I don't think the right or the conservative mostly are innocent of this. They are contributors to the Islamophobia in a big way. And so and now that they have formed an alliance with the Hindu community, which will be quite dangerous for us because they then will advance this.
Yeah. So so on your first point about the question of multiculturalism, so. There are lots of discussions on that. There are others who are probably much better placed than me to talk about that. But you have Tariq Maudud, who is really, the giant in the field who has engaged and discussed this topic, in detail. And you have people like Ted Cantle and others who've tried to have a very different view on how it works. Yeah. So those discussions about how we think about different communities in this country. Is very important, and the thing is, I can see arguments that might be more pro Ted Cantle in their views, which are not hugely problematic. I mean, you can have different views on these things. I think the problem comes, and you see that in the narrative of people like Louise Casey when they started looking at how we can look at integration in different ways. The way that they frame Muslims, they inherently don't understand the communities they're talking about. They have certain narratives. For example, they talk about Muslims, for example, being segregated and becoming more segregated. But the statistics from the census show the opposite is happening. The Muslims are actually not becoming more segregated; they're becoming less segregated. And Muslims aren't the most segregated religious community; they're actually second or third in that list. So a lot of these narratives that are out there are just plainly false, which are driving some of those discussions. And your second point was. The right wing, yes. So the right wing, right wing think tanks and organizations are clearly driving a lot of the Islamophobia in the public space. I mean, the fact that the prime minister of a country can talk about letterboxes in a way, this is right wing, far right language, which leads to people being attacked on the street. This is not like nothing. You can have a view about the burqa and niqab, and I have a view on the burqa and niqab, and everyone has a view that they might have about any of these items, and people can have whatever view that they choose to have. But that doesn't, I mean, using far-right, dog whistle, racist language, I mean, this is not someone who doesn't know what he's doing. This is someone who knows what he's doing, and it's hugely, hugely problematic. And the fact it goes all the way from the top. I mean, I think the campaign for mayor of London, I think, is one of the most biggest indicators of Islamophobia out there. And the reason why I think it's one of the biggest indicators is because it was a situation where Sadiq Khan, who is not someone who could be considered to be, a terrorist sympathizer or anything like that, but that was how he was framed. And it wasn't just done by one person, by Zach Goldsmith, who himself obviously ran a racist campaign and lost and failed miserably and then got promoted into the House of Lords by the Prime Minister. It's not just one person. He was the whole campaign was run by the Conservative Party. The Prime Minister of the country, Theresa May, was out there. The Home Secretary at the time, former Prime Minister, but at the time Home Secretary, was there defending the campaign and using similar language. I mean, this is something that the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, had to lied about a Muslim imam, because he was trying to attack Sadiq Khan, and he failed miserably and had to correct himself on the record because he lied about Muslims. I mean, this was the Prime Minister at the time, the Home Secretary at the time, the Defence Secretary at the time, Michael Fallon. All of these people were feeding this Islamophobic racist campaign for Mayor of London. And so the fact that it was so institutionalized, it was allowed to happen, that as a whole it didn't really get that much traction, that it was Islamophobic, that a campaign of that, to be honest, national scale, that was the type of traction it was getting from page news stories, and nobody really seemed to care other than some elements of the left. It is an indictment of our political system that was allowed to happen, and also that there has been no apology for that.
Miqdaad, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your talk. And I think all of us, the Muslim community, is really indebted to you for focusing on this issue and making it, institutionalizing our response through the center you've set up. But my question was, at the outset you said you were going to focus on the UK, but could you say something about the connection with global Islamophobia? Because we just can't look at it in isolation.
It's a very fair point, and it is a limitation of the talk that I gave, that I haven't engaged with the global Islamophobic discourse, which is hugely problematic, and the links to global Islamophobia, which obviously frame it in a certain way. How do I link it to? How can I talk? I mean, I think Islamophobia manifests itself in different places in different countries. What's happening in China is very different to what's happening in India. What's happening in India is very different to what's happening to Israel. And all of those are very different to what's happening in France right now, and Belgium and Austria and parts of Poland. But I think that especially across the globe, there are these underlying narratives which keep on being brought in about Muslims being a threat in different ways. I can't, like, so I think in France they bring the cultural angle in, and in Austria they talk about the Muslim Brotherhood being a conspiracy theory which are pulling the strings of everything in the world. In India you have love jihad as one of the biggest drivers of these discourse, these narratives that are created about Muslims. Are they all directly linked? In some ways, definitely, because they all feed into many similar stereotypes. But I think they also all have their own coloring in each of the different countries. I think that there is that global link to some extent, but I think that it manifests itself in very many different ways. So I just be slightly, not massively helpful.
Thank you very much. I think we're running out of time unless there are any final burning questions. Okay, we'll take one more.
If we look at France, this not candidate, but the person
Eric Zemmour
of Algerian Jewish descent or whatever.
Yeah.
He's now, I don't think even we have reached there yet. He's saying that nobody should be named Muhammad in France. So I don't think they will dare to do that here.
Yeah.
But we can see where it can go. Jamil's point is that unless those currents are coming this way. The other point is that this Andres Breivik, yeah, I haven't seen anybody call him a terrorist yet. They think he is mentally deranged, whatever, what they're trying to, all kinds of things, but not a terrorist.
Yeah, okay, so firstly about France. I mean, France's Islamophobia, as you rightly point out, is in many ways. We have to be slightly careful about comparing because comparisons have lots of challenges with them. But it's hard to see how anyone could describe France as being a better place for Muslims than the UK. Right? The UK is one of the places in the world where I would love to be more than anyone else. That's why I'm here. I mean, it's a place that I think is really important. So let's note that firstly. But I think that the Islamophobia in France is outrageous and it's state sponsored. It's whether it's Macron directly, whether it's people on the left, whether it's people on the right. It's across all political groups. Muslims are an enemy. I mean, there was just recently, Council of Europe had an image of a woman wearing a hijab, and they were trying to talk about Islamophobia, and France got the Council of Europe to pull down its campaign because it had a woman in hijab, because they obviously would argue that a woman in hijab is forced and all this other nonsense. So the Council of Europe on racism was not allowed to talk about Islamophobia with an image of a woman in hijab because that itself was problematic for France. I mean, France is a seriously challenging issue, and you're right that there are, you could think about things in terms of a pathway that things could get that bad. I'm always slightly conscious of these sort of conveyor belt approaches because there are very many nuances to France and the way that France works, which make it in many ways different to us. But I think the US is actually a very good example. I mean, what happened to Trump and the fact that Trump could get the number of votes that he could get, having talked about banning Muslims from entering the country. I mean, racism 101. That for me is a bigger concern. The narrative about Muslims can become in such a way that the threat is so normalized. And if you look at Islamophobia here in this country, it has in many ways become so normalized that you can get away with doing things. I mean, someone right now is the culture secretary, despite having made so many Islamophobic, racist remarks. A prime minister of this country has made racist remarks and Islamophobic remarks, and that doesn't seem to matter. So whilst I agree that thinking about things in terms of the how they develop is very important, also the nuances and different countries I think work very differently. Your second point was you made another point. Eric Zemmour. No, you said Eric Zemmour. There was something else you said, but I can't remember.
If you've forgotten, we can add this. On the other hand, Europe as a whole has a population deficit.
Yeah.
The only people who can come in numbers which are required, you're looking at 30-40 million, are Muslims from around. So there is a great need for statesmanship for Europe to understand this. Angela Merkel tried to do that, but she's suffering because of that, in that sense. But until Europe does that, this conflict will continue.
So I think Angela Merkel actually she resigned only because she's been there for so long. I mean, most people have, when they look back at what Angela Merkel did, I mean, she's been hugely successful. Not only has she been successful, and she's on the center right, not on the left at all, right? She's on the center right. Not only was she so successful that she changed the narrative, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is seen as a far right group, they basically are getting 5-10% in the vote right now when they were getting 15% and even challenging in many areas beforehand. She's been able to win the narrative to such an extent that the far right are pushed away. So I think that actually she's demonstrated that it is possible to be successful. It is possible to win the argument by actually standing up and showing statesmanship. And I think that in the end, that's something that we need to show far more than is happening right now.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end there. Muhammad Wali Muhammad Salawat.